and we're here with the Environment and Public Policy section of the Association for Conflict Resolution. I also want to introduce our co-chair of the Leadership Council this year. Diane, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and let people know where you are and how you came to be?
How I came to be here is a whole different story, but yes, Diane Olson. I am a practitioner with the Langdon Group. I'm based out of Salt Lake City, Utah, and it is beautiful springtime here. So, and I'm so happy. I just, Susan Goodwin and I just took over the reins from Mary and Deb Kleiman on the Leadership Council, or as the co-chairs. So they're very big shoes to fill. So we are open to all input and guidance from you all in the community.
Thank you. I just wanted to welcome you as our new co-chair for this section.
Yeah.
And for folks who are joining us today who might not be members of the Association for Conflict Resolution, this is a professional association that's international, and it supports collaboration and conflict resolution professionals across the spectrum, from our section, which is environment and public policy matters that we work on, to community-based resolution, restorative justice, arbitration, conciliation, all the way over to formal ombuds and other kinds of processes that use the skills that make up the field of conflict collaboration and resolution. So we welcome you, whether you're an EPP section member or not. We want to invite other folks who are interested in the work of public issues that might be undertaken by conflict resolution professionals working with public agencies at the federal, state, or local level. And today is a webinar sharing some information about how folks in our field might access that kind of work. And we're going to feature Chris from ERG, who is the lead entity on an Environment Protection Agency program that serves conflict resolution and prevention for issues across the US. So we want to welcome you today. This is a webinar that will be recorded, so we can put it into our section library as a resource for our members. So we welcome you to today's rosters and contract lists for working with federal agencies webinar. We will have ample time for questions today. We'll have a short introduction to some of the work that's been happening at the roster level. And then we'll go into a presentation by Chris from ERG, sharing a little bit about how that prime contract works and their services. And then we'll have time for questions and answers before we wrap at 10:30. I'm on the Pacific. Well, I'm on the Pacific Coast, so that's where I am. That's the time zone I'm in. And I just welcome folks whichever time zone you're from. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, about an hour and a half north of Seattle. So that's where I'm located today. So welcome to the webinar. We're going to have a short time for you to introduce yourselves to others. And we're going to ask in your short breakout group with 3 people to introduce yourself, your name, the region where you work primarily, and any specialties or expertise that you'd like to share with others that you bring into the field. So we're going to give folks some chance to test their own mics, greet others in the room, and do a quick breakout to do some introductions. And I'm going to ask, Diane, if you haven't given me co-host, you'll need to set up those breakouts, random groups of 3. Thank you.
Yes, I think I have calculated that properly. So
thank you so much.
You ready to switch over?
Thank you.
How much time, Mary?
Oh, we'll just need
10 minutes?
10 minutes max, 7. If you each go 2, then we'll all have a turn. That'd be lovely.
Okay, perfect.
And thank you.
Here we go.
Thank you all for sharing with your introductions. Who's in the room? We've got a nice crowd here today, and we really appreciate your interest in what we have to offer. I'm going to share screen here and briefly go through some introductory remarks about the Association for Conflict Resolution's EPP section and what it is that we're looking to accomplish here, both in this webinar and in the series. So my apologies if my audio goes poorly after I share screen. If I disappear off my visual, it's just me making more room for all of us to hear me without delay. I'm in rural America and cannot always count on my bandwidth. Are you able to see the slide for today?
Looks great, Mary.
Great. Okay, so we'll carry on and just share that our mission in the Environment Public Policy section is to envision a just society that's capable of inclusively and equitably solving its most complex environmental and public policy issues. Our mission is to strengthen the community of conflict and collaboration practitioners who in turn support their communities to make informed decisions through inclusive, equitable engagement in these types of issues. So many of you might be practicing with different backgrounds and expertise, but might find yourself under this common umbrella of purpose. And our purpose of today's conversation is to both engage you as participants and learners in thinking about ways to access environmental and collaboration work with public agencies. This may be of interest to you professionally, personally, or it may be of interest to your organization. But we think it's important that we grow the field with diverse voices and perspectives. And that's why we want more folks to be exposed and aware of how this work functions. Our long-term goal is to broaden the diversity and mix of practitioners included on these types of federal contracting rosters and lists, as well as increase the number of federal agencies that use our services and these types of approaches to address complex problems. And a secondary step is informing an advisory group who are working with the EPP section to maintain, if you will, an inherited roster of environmental conflict resolution professionals that had shifted from its former home to a new relationship with both EPP section and Mediate.com. And I'm glad that Colin's here today, Colin Rule from Mediate.com, as this is a joint effort between the group of us to maintain a list of practitioners that is broad and diverse. Mind you, this list is not attached to any contracts or certain said guaranteed work. It is simply a constellation of practitioners, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that's functioning after its move. So today, we're going to have some time to do that little breakout. We're going to have some panel time as a large group, and we're going to have the bulk of our time in questions and answers. Let me just pause. Is that okay with folks? That's where we're going today. And I just want to share that in all things EPP, we try to embody our shared values about the ways that we work together. And I want to share with you that today our biggest goal is to keep people informed. We will adjust the schedule if you need us to, so please let us know if you need accommodation, want any kind of captions on what was being said. There will be a recording you can view after. And we are taking a multidisciplinary approach to these webinars. So please ask any questions that come up in chat or on audio, whatever you're most comfortable with. But our goal here today is to empower you with information, to connect you with other people, and to help us imagine more wonderful ways we can resolve conflict constructively. So today's panelists include myself doing a small intro on the ECR roster update. And we also have Chris Lammy from ERG, and that is the prime vendor for the Environmental Protection Agency's Conflict Prevention and Resolution Services contract. So we'll be hearing from Chris shortly. Or sorry, Christopher is Chris. What would you like us to go by, Chris? You have any preference?
Chris is fine. Thank you.
Okay, you just want to make sure. So I'm
Yeah.
just going to briefly run through some background. People might not be aware that in the fall of 2022, the original ECCR roster, which is a list of practitioners that was maintained and managed by the John S. McCain National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution. They've also gone through a name change since this early work. They had desired to move this roster away from their entity and move it into hands of parties who are not part of a federal government system. They asked and requested if EPP section would work with Mediate.com in partnership to administer and maintain a website where this roster could be held publicly. That is the nature of the request. And throughout 2022 and 2023, we updated the roster through a memorandum of agreement and built a new website, thank you, Mediate.com, and produced some public notifications to folks both on the roster, organizations that use and rely on the roster, to go ahead and participate in activating this new site and engaging others in finding it. So we can take a short journey out to that site. I'm going to stop share screen and ask if you might do that, Diane, from where you are, if possible. I am concerned that if I try to go online, I may end up losing you altogether, given my bandwidth speeds here today.
So the ECR roster, right?
Our roster. Yeah, if you just take a, we can give people a picture of what this roster site functions currently.
Yes.
And we want to make it clear that this is much more of a list than a roster. There is no entity managing or sending contracts to this group. It is simply a portal by which folks are looking for and trying to identify teammates or possible co-consultants or service providers can access this site to identify and locate individuals who were already on the roster. Everyone on the prior roster was transitioned over. Colin, this is a moment in the webinar. If you'd like to speak up, please come off mute and share any features you'd like people to know about.
Sure, you bet. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, we're really excited about our partnership with the EPP section. Obviously, there's a long history to the roster, and we want to continue to invest in it and raise its profile to help practitioners connect with agencies that are looking for help. So if I'm sorry that I'm not in a position where I can turn on my video, but if you want to take a look at the yellow button there, so you can actually see who's on the roster. And what we have is, some ways people can search full text. We've got full bios. You can click on any of the bios there and see how it's structured. So, that's interesting. Why don't you click on the top result there? Just view. There you go. And you can see kind of how it's structured. So, we gather information. I think there are, I'm trying to think how long the roster's been around, Mary. Maybe you can correct me on that. But we do gather a lot of information about practitioners. And, we do have agencies that come in and say, hey, I'm looking for somebody to help me with, forest resource plan and in this particular region. Can you help me out? And we're actually building some AI powered functionality that will allow visitors to come in and describe their situation in some detail, and then we can look through all the rosters and the expertise that people have and make some suggestions. But the goal is to, provide a really robust list so that any agency that's looking for a facilitator can come in and review the information, find somebody good, and then reach out and contact them directly. So that's the vision, and we hope to continue with the partnership with the EPP section to make the roster richer and raise its profile over the next few years. So if you'd like to join, please don't hesitate to fill out that form, and then we'll communicate back to you.
Thank you, Colin. So what we are in the middle of is transitioning from an old roster data set. So if you are on this roster, you were on the former roster, you might want to go out and check this site and make sure that your information is accurate, up to date, and reflects the kind of practice you want to be attracting into your work world these days. If you are interested in joining the roster, we are in the process of expanding the application process so that while it does designate senior practitioners, there is room for mid-level career folks to be in a roster. In the past, there was a preponderance of hours that one had to have at the table in front of a group, and that was a way to assure that there was lived experience in the room facilitating service-related contracts and provided a sense of senior practitioner access. Well, we know that this roster and the field is growing at a rate that we need to expand and be more inclusive of new diverse specialties that are required out of the environmental justice standards that come from each federal agency now currently. We also know that we need to update the roster to reflect the diversity of populations that we serve. So as you sign up for the roster, you'll be invited into an updated application process, which will allow you to identify the stage of career, the specialties, and the regions where you work. So we invite you to join us as we build out and expand, as Colin described, the next phase of the roster. Again, we do not provide contracts to people. Okay, that is not the nature. In this sense, it is a list, it's a repository of the breadth of our field and the number and diverse backgrounds that our practitioners come from. So that is a value, folks, and we hope that you'll join us in letting others know about how to grow and expand the field of potential partners for you as a team builder, and also for organizations trying to find the right fit for their community and the issues they're working on. Now, that's one small slice of a roster. As we said, EPP and Mediate.com are administrators of this, and one of the ways that we do try to administer is to send people on the roster list and our sections updates about opportunities that we get notified of. So if a federal agency lets us know that there is a call, we will, one, post it out on the roster for people to see it, so it's public and transparent, accessible to everyone. We will email members of both the roster and the EPP section about opportunities for calls for proposals, etc. So what we're trying to do is make more transparent the pathways to opportunities for work, but we have no guarantee that this will actually result in work. So we need to be very clear about what this particular list roster does versus other types of prime contract rosters that exist for each of the federal agencies. And that's why we're so grateful that Chris is here with us today to take us into a different kind of roster and show us how that functions and works in the field for both the public agency that is in need and matching and fitting those service needs to the communities where they're being called into work. So just want to pause here. If you have questions about the roster, this is a great time to write them into chat. We've got a big half hour at the end for QA, and we just want to leave you a moment to reflect on the roster information and see if you have any questions for myself or Colin, and we'll put those into chat and catch up with them as we move into our QA later this morning. All right. So as we mentioned, this is a roster series, and the first in our series, we met with the Kearns and West team who manage the prime vendor contract for the Department of Interior. So when the Department of Interior, any agencies that fall under their rubric have a need, they move to Kearns and West to fulfill those service needs through a prime vendor contract. If you're interested in that historical webinar, it's on our EPP section website, and you can learn more about how they manage interaction on that program. Today, we're going to hear about how the EPA manages their prime vendor contract. And in future webinars, we're going to go around the tour of federal agencies and see how each of them manage their federal contracts, so we can create some transparency for all of you to understand, if you want to be on one of those, how to get there. So I'm happy and grateful that you could be with us today, Chris. It's really appreciated that you could flex with us when we found the right time for our members. And we want to turn the table to you for you to share your background and the history, if you will, of the prime vendor work that your ERG does, and how people interact with you in the ways that your organization provides conflict resolution and prevention services. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Do you mind if I share my screen? I have a few slides I can put up. Okay.
That sounds like a great idea.
Go. Is that all showing up for you? Okay,
That looks
great.
good.
So I'm Chris Lammy with Eastern Research Group, ERG. We're a contractor to the US EPA. My background is actually in environmental communications, a lot of plain language, data visualization, communicating climate science and other topics to a wide audience, including non-scientists. I do some facilitation, but I'm not a conflict resolution professional. What I do for this contract is manage the overall contract as a project manager. So I'll be speaking from that perspective. I have to give the disclaimer that we are a contractor, so I'm not speaking on behalf of EPA. I'm just speaking on behalf of my own organization. But we will tell you a little bit about the EPA contract and how it's set up. And how it works. So first off, this is a centralized contract that's available throughout the US EPA. Over on the right is the map of the EPA regions, all regional offices, headquarters offices, anybody in the agency of 15,000 people or so. I forget what the head count is lately, but there's a lot that the EPA does, and anybody can access this contract. And so it's providing access to a roster of experts in collaboration and conflict resolution. That includes facilitation, mediation, organizational development, including within the EPA, training for external parties as well as within the EPA. That includes training in specific skills. It also includes diversity-related training, environmental justice topics, all sorts of training topics that happen through this contract. But it includes coaching. There's individual coaching, group coaching, thinking about leadership coaching, for example. That is another thing that can happen through this contract. And then it provides associated support. So if conflict resolution requires meeting support, webinars, in-person meetings, logistics, note-taking, AV, all of that can be covered here, as well as technical support. Sometimes there's scientific or technical support that goes into or complements one of these collaboration processes. So that can happen here too, as long as it's associated. Just a few samples of types of projects that come through this contract. One frequent type of project is working with Superfund community advisory groups, or CAGs. Those are groups of citizens or community organizations, some quite long running, because it can take a long time to investigate and clean up a Superfund site. So Those are really important groups that give the community a voice. And so folks from this roster have helped to form those groups, set them up with charters and ground rules to be effective. And then in some cases continue to facilitate those groups and help them to work over time. Less frequent, but something that has happened is working on allocations. So if you're familiar with Superfund sites, you know somebody has to pay to clean them up. And if there are potentially responsible parties, sometimes more than one, this contract has been used to help work with those parties and fairly allocate a financial responsibility for cleanup. The stakes can be pretty high for something like that. Mediating disputes, permitting disputes between EPA and a tribal entity, or between EPA and a state or municipal entity. Anything like that is fair game. Planning and facilitating community meetings. Communities who are very concerned about a Superfund site, a pollution source, something that's happened in their midst. The train derailment that happened in Ohio last year. That's an example of a very high profile case that the EPA had to work with, and people were, understandably very upset, emotions very high. We also support meetings that are not quite as contentious or more proactive, engaging with communities, with community partners proactively on environmental justice topics, for example, a lot of education, helping people learn about grant opportunities and things like that. Providing training to EPA's own staff on various topics like public engagement, and then providing group coaching, team building, facilitation support, strategic planning for EPA's own offices to help them be a more effective organization. So there are many other types of things that happen, but those are kind of a sampling of the types of projects, some of which we see regularly. About the roster. It is a roster to support this contract. That's our sole mission in putting the roster together. So we are the prime contractor, and our role we're tasked with is to coordinate the roster and get work out to the best available practitioners for any given project. On the roster, we're talking about more than 100 firms, collectively hundreds of individuals. And that includes a wide range of sizes. So there are some large firms who I'm sure are familiar to many of you, but there are also quite a few solo practitioners on the roster. And many of them have been doing this for a long time. ERG has held this contract for about 5 years, but the contract itself has lived under various iterations for, I believe, at least 2 decades, no more. So many people have supported this contract for a long time and have done a lot of great work. And that, of course, includes a lot of collaboration and conflict resolution specialties, but also some folks who are on the roster to provide associated technical support. So mechanically what happens, we get a job from EPA. We need a facilitator to support this scenario, this case. If it's a new job that's not, an obvious follow-on to somebody who's already in the midst of the process, who's already created those relationships, if it's a new process, we circulate that opportunity to the roster. We do what's called a circulated work notice. Everybody has the opportunity to bid. Nobody has to bid. And in fact, most of the time, most people may pass on it because it needs to be done right away, or it's just not quite your area of specialty. Sometimes the requirements, the qualifications are pretty narrow because we need somebody with a very specific type of expertise or experience. But everybody can bid, submit a qualification statement and resume to us. We review EPA, other parties have the opportunity to review. Sometimes interviews are conducted. And again, this is the idea of making sure all the parties in the dispute have the opportunity to participate in selecting the facilitator and to feel comfortable with the facilitator or mediator who's selected in terms of their approach and their style. We make a provisional selection, work out the cost details, negotiate as needed. Sometimes we do have to really figure out what can be done with the budget, what's realistic to do in the scope. Once we settle all that, then of course we make a final selection and award. And part of our job as the prime contractor is that we have to make that selection. EPA doesn't make the selection. Legally, they can't, but of course their feedback is very important to us. So a little bit about joining the roster. I mentioned before that our mandate is to build a roster to support the needs of this contract. That is an important point. It does create some limitations. But I'll note each roster member is a subcontractor to ERG. And the contract requires that work be performed by roster members who are subcontractors and have gone through what's called the consent process, where the EPA contracting officer and their colleagues have reviewed qualifications. They're comfortable adding somebody to the roster. So that has to happen. And to add folks to the roster, there's paperwork to do. It is a government contract. There's our staff time and some EPA staff time for that consent review. So what this means, just kind of the reality of it is, we really focus on practitioners who are well aligned with the work that takes place under this contract, because of the investment in resources that it takes to do this, to get people onto the contract, and the investment of your time. So if you're going to fill out all the paperwork, we want to make sure it's a good fit, and that you'll have the opportunity to do work, and to win jobs. So we don't have an open call for nominations. And I know that with the resources we have under the contract, we end up being focused on specifically getting people onto the contract who are going to be that good fit. But that's not to say that we're not interested in new people, because there are lots of great people, and we've been really excited to add them when we have the opportunity. So good roster candidates. We're looking for subject matter expertise and experience, cultural competency. We recognize that there's a need to continue to grow and diversify the field. There's often a need and a desire in communities to have a facilitator who has some shared background, who really understands the community, has competency working with the community. That's cultural background, race, ethnicity, language, all sorts of considerations there. Folks who are open to a mix of small jobs, large jobs. Some of these are one and done. Some of these are sustained commitments, and they're often on a fast turnaround. And you need to be willing and able to sign a government contract. I won't pretend there's not a lot of language to sign. The clauses we have to flow down, insurance requirements, timekeeping requirements, put up with the paperwork we're all required to fill out for every estimate, be able to bill hourly, and be able to work at rates that can work for the government. Quickly, I think we have some more discussion later, so I won't say a ton about building diversity. I'll just say that it's important to us. We've done some targeted recruiting to try to build out diversity, to fill a variety of niches on our roster. We recognize that folks who have not been on this roster for 20 years, or maybe new to government contracting altogether, could benefit from some help with the paperwork, with some of the uniqueness of government contracting. So we provide coaching. We also try to find opportunities where a project budget with EPA's blessing could support partnerships, where somebody who's been doing this for 20 years can mentor, and often are very happy to mentor somebody who may be great on conflict resolution, but new to the environmental conflict resolution field, or new to EPA. We want to promote competition, so that it's not this feeling that, oh, it's the same 5 firms or the same 5 practitioners who win all the work. So we try to do that and be open to transferable experience. So if you're facilitating a Superfund CAG and the requirement says you need lots of experience facilitating Superfund CAGs, that really limits the number of people who can compete. So we like to try to be open where we can to transferable experience. Oh, so you haven't done that, but you've done something like it. Let's consider that. So we hope that that opens the door to more people being able to participate and really win work under the contract. Quickly, what's next? The contract we're working on now actually expires in July. For that reason, we're not really adding folks to the roster right now unless there's a specific job that needs their support. There's a new 5-year contract pending in the works. It has not been awarded yet. We don't know who will receive that contract, so I can only speak about it by giving you the name of it. Its new name, Environmental Collaboration and Conflict Resolution Services, ECCRS. And while there are limited opportunities to get onto the roster for this contract that's on its last legs, under the new contract, whoever the prime contractor is, will need to build out their roster. And so, in addition to the folks they may have already from their bid, there's the opportunity at the beginning to get some more folks on the roster to really round it out. So this year is a good time for folks to get in on that sometime when it's awarded, but that's not something we can predict. Do you want me to take questions now or part of the discussion? Diane, Mary, what would be useful?
We're headed right into questions. So it's perfect timing to just drop right into all the questions that might come up, including those specifically to you.
Perfect.
It's perfect. Thank you. So there is a question. Someone would like to learn more about the timeline, the process for mid-level practitioner application. Where are there windows and opportunities for mid-level career folks to be engaged? So I'll share that one. Open it for you first, Chris, and then others.
Yeah, we certainly have folks on the roster who are at a mid-level, and we have some who are even just kind of starting out in the field. All have been valuable, and many people at different levels have been able to get work. There are projects that come through from EPA where having 20 years of experience is less important than having a particular competency or having some really deep subject matter knowledge or something that a newer practitioner might bring. There are also cases where EPA feels like budget-wise, they're not looking for somebody with great seniority. They're happy to have somebody who may be at a more junior or mid-level rate. And also where they already are setting up a mentorship opportunity where they need a co-facilitator, for example, to pair with somebody who's a senior who's already working on a case. So we're very much open to that, whether it's mid-level folks on existing firms or mid-level folks coming in on their own. There's no prohibition on that for sure.
Thank you. And in terms of the roster that Mediate.com and EPP are maintaining as a sort of overall list, we encourage anyone at any point in their career to submit an application, because the culture that we're promoting is to build teams so that we have a diverse lived experience, both generationally and geographically and topically from identities. So we would encourage folks to be as forthcoming as you'd like to be about the specialties you'd like to be involved with. And that's one way we're trying to build out access for mid-level folks. I know other programs are doing the same. I don't want to speak for them, but we will continue to feature as many as possible that are building out what we call mid-career, entry career level opportunities for folks. And thank you, Chris, for getting your information into the contact list, or into the chat for folks. I do have a question for Chris and ERG. Are you involved in helping entities stand up what are called community representation initiatives, CRIs, that the EPA might mandate when there's a negotiated settlement or agreement or a consent order? And could you speak about those? Because that work really interfaces a lot with what our section is well known for.
Yeah, absolutely. That certainly can fall within the scope of this contract. I can't say that there have been a lot of those cases that we've been involved with lately. But I can think of at least a few that were set up in the past, and that ongoing support for those processes is going on now. I can think of a few cases. So yeah, certainly in scope. And very much the kind of thing that this contract can support well.
And do you mind describing to people what that means in special EPA talk? Because every agency does community representation a little differently. So in that world, if you were involved, what does that mean for people when you set up a community representation group?
I really don't feel like I can speak to the specifics on
Okay.
that.
I don't want to put you on the
It's
spot.
really, certainly as far as the legalities of it and how EPA would set those up. I can say that we've seen them happen in different ways. And I think that the general principles that I've seen be followed or desired to be followed are the kinds of principles you might follow in setting up any kind of community advisory type of group. Thinking about membership, who's at the table. We hope talking with people in advance so that there's people feel heard in designing the process and even getting there. Being collaborative and setting agendas and such, having ground rules for the group, really understanding how autonomous is the group. Do they have a decision-making role? What is EPA's role in the process? We've seen some situations where Superfund CAG, for example, has some decision-making types of power. They take votes. There are other groups whose job is maybe to be more advisory, and some where it's sometimes feels more like a group that's assembled to hear EPA give periodic presentations and then be able to ask questions at a forum for that. So I think there's always a need to scope that out up front and make sure expectations are really clear, so people aren't getting the wrong impression or disappointed with the outcomes, the expectations. So I wish I could say more about it, but I hope that's somewhat helpful. And just emphasizing that where possible, it's great to have the expertise from folks in this profession in designing that process.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of different scales that it sounds like work happens. Some is very project site and defined and very narrow in terms of scope and approach. And then there's that larger, how do you set up a community of representation on a large complex issue? So thank you for giving people an example that goes really broad, that there could be opportunity to support what we call public engagement side of conflict prevention and collaboration work. So that's just one of the doors that EPA uses to bring the community to the table. And I wanted our members to know that some of these are very specific, tight kind of scopes, it looks like, Chris, in the work, where it's very specific to a project scale or a location versus a longer term relationship. So thank you for adding the EPA's website for the contract is now in the chat as well, if people would like to see what the agency has set up for this prime vendor to be providing a service. So other questions about how the work is identified and flows into ERG and possibly out to the roster members that they maintain. And if there's not questions, ideas you'd like to explore about roster work and diversifying the pool of parties who are in them.
Hi, this is Cameron from Kearns and West. I'm just curious how you go about managing your subs in the list, like internally, what platforms you guys use to keep track of it.
Sure. As part of this contract, EPA requires us to have a tracking system that's capable of generating all sorts of data, different dimensions of the data. And so our roster is integrated into that system so that we can easily generate contact lists, make sure keep track of subcontracts, task orders and such, and keep track of the financials.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else have a question you'd like to bring to the table? Sure, Gideon, let's hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Chris. I know we talked a little bit about this a few weeks ago, Chris. Can you talk a little bit more about the rate and the billing? You mentioned that it's done by the hour. Are there project budgets? Can you give any, I'm not sure you can, but can you give any guidance on rates? So just overall questions about the project budgets, how they're created, rates, that type of stuff.
Sure. Well, as you might guess, I can't give any guidance on this call about specific hourly rates that practitioners might choose to charge. But the contract is a time and materials contract. So for those familiar with contracts, what that means is that we have a set of labor categories. That's how the government would like us to manage the work. And so labor performed under this contract is billed at hourly rates within those labor categories. So what that means is somebody who would like to say, oh, I run workshops for a flat fee of $5,000 per workshop. Well, under this contract, we need to bill as hourly labor. And so in your agreement with the ERG, your subcontract agreement, you'll establish rates, hourly rates for specific labor categories. If you're a very senior practitioner, it might be a DRP level, let's say level 3. And then there's a rate associated with that. If you're a firm with a wide range of price points, you may have a few different labor categories, and there are a few different labor category tracks as well. So there's a dispute resolution practitioner labor category track that has junior, mid-level, and senior rate opportunities. But then there's another track for communication specialists, which can be wide-ranging communication types of support, outreach support, and then a track for scientific and technical support. And again, it has different levels within, or different rungs in the ladder on each of those tracks. And so you'd establish rates for that. And then what you do is you'll bill to us each month how many hours you spent at each of those labor categories. We need to know who the people are who build those hours, because individuals have to be approved to participate in these projects on the roster through us. And so that's how it works. At the outset of the project, we will agree on a budget. So we need to have the service provider develop a cost estimate based on their approved rates, and the number of hours they expect to take to do the work. EPA typically has a budget in mind. They've been budgeted a certain amount for a project. So we triangulate on that. If you can do it within the budget EPA has set, that's wonderful. We agree on that. If you do the math and feel like it's going to take a lot more hours than perhaps the EPA was thinking, then we discuss it. And maybe there are some assumptions that can be cleared up on either side that might make some adjustments. Maybe we do have to adjust the scope to what can be done, or maybe more money needs to be found. It's just an education process and sometimes takes some iterations. But at the end of the day, you'll get an award that will have a specific budget, a not to exceed budget ceiling, and that's what you'll have to work within. Getting to that answer your question?
Yes, thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Very good. Thanks.
Thanks. Anyone have a question of your own or a follow-up? Well, I have a short follow-up. You mentioned, Chris, that there's an individual approval for each person who gets on the roster for the labor category that they will bill for. So
That's
there's
right.
a one-to-one relationship of the individual to EPA for that service task category, service labor. Are there other requirements? Do people need GSA approval to work in a federal agency government environment? Are there other small business requirements of you that you would need to prepare yourself to be even considered on this from a business practices standpoint?
Great question. So yeah, the initial agreement is with your firm. And if you're an individual, that may be your own LLC that you've created or however you do business, right? The individual approval is something that we do, checking your qualifications against the labor category requirements, because for each of those levels, like I talked about, junior, mid, senior level, there are educational and years of experience requirements that come down from EPA. So let's just say hypothetically, one of them requires a bachelor's degree plus 10 years of experience. As part of the individual approval, if you want to put somebody in that category, we just ask you to share a resume that shows degrees, shows enough work history to show that you indeed meet those qualifications, and in many cases vastly exceed them. So, but that's what the individual qualification looks like. People do not need clearances to do this work. I have not encountered any cases where we needed somebody to have a specific clearance, be it a security clearance, or say a federal ID badge, a PIV card. We know those things that can take a lot of work to get, but you need a sponsor. These are shorter term gigs that typically don't require it. They do, of course, require you to sign have a confidentiality agreement, as you would with anything in this profession. So, but that's really it as far as those requirements. And I'm really glad you asked about small businesses, Mary. We're always encouraged to do business with small businesses. EPA has goals for us to do business with small businesses. And I love that so many of the roster members we have are small businesses. As part of getting onto the roster, we have to ask everybody to fill out some forms that indicate their small business status. So that's just something you would fill out. There's I believe, self-certification here. It does help to be registered with sam.gov. And there's some other things I can actually follow up on because they're things that are helpful, though not always absolutely required. And when it comes to small businesses, just being able to certify certain things, self-certify certain things about your business size, ownership status, that's helpful to us in the documentation we need to furnish to the government. But it's mostly a form that you would fill out for us. If you have employees, you do of course have to have workers' compensation insurance, and you'd need to use or enroll in the E-Verify program that the federal government requires for verifying the work eligibility of your employees. So there are, a few things like that.
Yeah. there's usually housekeeping, so thanks. That gives a small
yeah.
business a sense of level of effort for the kind of possible return on this particular prime vendor list.
Yep.
As related to other possible prime vendor lists where they might have a sweeter spot. That's why we want to feature as many as possible. So thanks for being deep in the weeds on some of this, because I think some of our members actually care about this particular business interface. So Deborah, you have a question. Let's hear from you.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I just want to get the earlier part clear because I had to join late. I was on another call. And so it sounded like what Chris said is that they're also in the process of renewing for a 5-year contract to do this work again. Maybe I got that wrong, so please clarify that part.
That's correct. Yeah,
that's correct.
That's correct. I mean, we're a bidder for it, but it hasn't been awarded. It could go to somebody else. So
okay,
that'll happen at some point this year.
So then the avenue to work if ERG gets the new contract, the avenue is to go through the first link you put up of the ECR or whatever it's called now, that roster. Is that how, when you're talking about looking for small businesses, women-owned small businesses, is that the information we're putting into this other roster that Mary started out the presentation with? Or how does this, what's the nexus between working with ERG and going through this roster that is sort of a carryover from people who had been on the roster many years with ECCR?
The only nexus is that some people are on both rosters.
So you have a separate roster?
Correct. We maintain a separate roster specific to the US EPA CPRS contract. That's the only thing we're actually allowed to do with that roster. It's a separate, smaller roster. Not surprising that there are some folks who are on both rosters. But
so if you are awarded the new contract, then how does one go about to meet the credentials that you're looking for?
So to get onto the EPA roster, there are definitely some folks who are on the current roster who we've already included in the bid, so that if we're awarded the new contract, then some folks have a foot in the door, and then reach out to me if we're awarded.
Okay.
If somebody else is awarded it, that other prime contractor would be the folks to reach out to. It's possible that contacting EPA, they may refer you to the prime contractor, but then it would be a process of going through the contractor, us or whomever, and we're happy to walk you through the process, talk a little bit more about what's needed, work with you, see if it's a good fit and worth the investment of your time, and then I'm happy to go from there.
Yes, because I was at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for 32 years. So I worked in the environmental, the cultural resources.
Yeah.
Then we set up a unit on alternative dispute resolution, and I was there for 21 years. When I left, boom, COVID happened. But I did manage through my humble attempts to register with the federal government. So I'm a federally certified contractor and a woman-owned small business. But again, as a small business owner and having your tentacles out in all these places, when I have gone in SAM.gov now, I felt like I saw a $5 million contract in there that was like maybe out there, or it sounded like it was an EPA one and it was conflict resolution. So I don't know for sure. This is from memory. I'm trying to understand all the machinations. So thank you, Chris. Thanks for your contact information.
You bet.
That's my only question.
Feel free to reach out. I'd love to chat with you.
Other questions? Well, we have one question we're asking regularly at the EPP section, which is, what are the specialties and expertise that are needed in the future? Where is the growth and the change happening in the field where these rosters need new faces, new experiences, and new insights that we are catching up with, if you will, as a field. So, Chris, could you speak to what you've seen shifting over the years you've had the ERG contract and this prime vendor? What do you see changing in the ways that different specialties are being emphasized?
Great question.
Years ago, we didn't have big data and tech at the table, right?
Right.
Had a strategy for big data and tech at the table.
Yeah.
So could you give us a sense of what's coming that you see?
Yeah. Well, I can say at least over the past 5 years, somewhat accelerated by the pandemic. Of course, it's moving to virtual engagements or hybrid engagements, and doing that really smoothly and skillfully so that people who are engaged virtually are still part of the process and are still equitably able to access information and participate and be heard. So I think there's a growing need for real skill with using the technology to engage people, virtual facilitation techniques and such. It's even since the pandemic, it's been convenient and budget saving in cases for folks to continue to meet virtually. I think the other thing we've seen, this is probably more a product of different presidential administrations, all having their own priorities. Under the current administration, there has been a lot of emphasis on environmental justice. Administrator Regan has been very visible going out to visit communities who've had longstanding concerns and working to try to bring help. And we've been happy to help bring facilitation support and other forms of support under this contract to many communities. So that's an area where we've seen recent growth and emphasis. And that includes looking for practitioners with cultural competency, looking for practitioners with experience working with communities that have environmental justice concerns, an increase in Civil Rights Act, Title VI cases that the agency works with and tries to support, and in some cases is working on some pretty innovative pilot programs to try to remedy longstanding issues and concerns. So I think that's an area, both in terms of qualifications, background, and subject matter expertise that we've seen grow a lot. Recognition that the old ways of doing things sometimes didn't do quite enough and left people out. Engagement with tribal entities, tribal nations and such is another area where I see a lot of effort to do better, to do more, and to do more than the minimum that the law might or the regs might require in terms of engagement, around a permitting process or something like that.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing from your side of the needs and assessment, what's out there in the way of needs. So Deborah, you've got another question. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, it just struck me. Chris, how does EPA interface now with the building of the new energy grid? Does EPA have any role in that? I mean, I know you mentioned the Superfund sites, but I was just curious about, are you looking at anything as the Inflation Reduction Act and all of this money that includes funding for environmental, inclusiveness, environmental justice that is in the IRA, which is quite a bit of money. What does EPA have any jurisdiction over any of the new stuff that's happening in the energy area?
It's a great question, and one that I'm not qualified to answer. I can only speak as a contractor, and I can't speak on behalf of EPA or EPA's regulatory authorities. What I will say is we've not seen cases under this contract looking at energy infrastructure, energy siting and such. So we've been mostly focused on the regulations that kind of EPA's bread and butter, CERCLA law and the Superfund related regulations, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, some of those that really explicitly give EPA roles. And then Civil Rights Act when it comes to, say, EPA related permitting decisions for air and water pollution. So that's I think that we could probably get a better answer from EPA, Office of General Counsel, because I don't want to say they don't have any role. You can see where I'm coming from, though.
Understood. I'm just taking this
Yeah.
little amount of time to talk to all you experts, because some of us are just in our own little silos here. So no problem. That was very, very helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Wonderful insights about how this prime vendor contract works. And it's a fortuitous time, actually, Chris, for you to be here when it's in a renewal cycle. So people understand that these run in 5-year blocks, may or may not get it. It may be the same roster. It may be a new convener of a roster. And that's why people should stay apprised of these cycles, because there are openings and opportunities. And just because a list has been built and it's been big doesn't mean that it's complete, that there might be gaps or needs that you might be bringing that they don't know that you exist yet. So we really want to encourage our members to stretch where you feel brave, to feel connected where you didn't know, and know how to get out and get connected. And we have been asking a lot about this specialties question, because as we grow the list that we keep, not attached to resources in any way other than information and networks of people who have skills and interest, we're looking to understand what specialties you would want to see featured in lists like this. So we do have a little time here before we close. Do people, Anna, Deborah, John, Charlotte, Lucy, anybody we haven't heard from, Siobhan, are there specialties that you hope that will be honored and recognized as we move forward, that you think are important and want to make sure we are thinking and considering as we grow and improve these rosters and lists? Anyone welcome to share on chat or verbal? So Deborah, go ahead. Thank you.
No, I guess can you give some examples of the types of things that when you talk about specialties?
Well, one is we heard from Chris that the specialty of being able to run a very good, tight hybrid meeting, virtual and live participants. That's a technical specialty, if you will.
Yes, yes.
Working with big data, understanding the structure of open source data and how that may confound or complicate decision making when people are mandated to use best available science. How much information is meaningful versus available. So that idea of how do we make room for tech and data in the negotiations and table. So Colin, I know you've had some thoughts about this from, does AI have a place at the multi-party table? So there are many sort of unknowns out there in the world, and that's one of them. Does AI belong at the multi-party table? But again, there are other specialties like intercultural communications, trauma and historical trauma, and working with people who are impacted, both historically and contemporarily. Those are some different kinds. So just thinking about that, temperament assessments for long-term projects. Thank you. Colin, did you want to say something? I thought I saw your button change there, but.
Sure. I just wanted to say there's a lot going on with AI right now in the ODR field. And I'm eager to extend those conversations into the multi-party space. We've had some discussions within CBI about the appropriate role of AI, but we have an organization called ICODER, the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, that's issued ethical standards for the use of technology in the dispute resolution process. It'd be very interesting to think about having a specific set of guidelines for multi-party practice, but it's coming. So it's definitely worthwhile to invest some time in paying attention to all of these developments. And I think I hope that the EPP section will lead in continuing this conversation as we figure out how AI fits into the work that we do.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else have something you'd like to share? I know that the working intertribal is a really important piece of the work ahead, and there's a number of organizations that are looking to build out that Native-led, Native-run organizations being in these spaces, leading these conversations. So we're trying to grow as many practitioners as we are opportunities for work. So I want you to know that EPP section looks at both ends of that equation. How do we build the environment for people to be successful in this work and to get their bearings in the field to see where they could be of most benefit and use with their skills and expertise. So we really appreciate you, Chris, taking the time today to share and demystify something that feels very big and very important because it gets so much important work done in the United States. But it does feel like a little bit of a mystery for many of us who aren't attached to big firms or haven't been mentored in a way that taught us about this particular gate into public agency work. So we really appreciate you making time today and hanging with us while we got this scheduled. Any other? Go ahead.
I was going to say thank you for having me, and thank you for all the great questions too.
So any other questions or appreciations in closing anyone would like to share? We've got about 7 minutes before we wrap for today. And most of all, at EPP section, we thank you. We know that we might be a small group in the room, but we know these videos get viewed when people have time. So that's why we put them in our library. So please share them if you know someone couldn't come today and you think they might be interested. Anyone else want to just give rounds for opening and closing if there's anything you'd like to share or say?
Mary, I'll just say again, thank you. Thank you to you for convening and pulling this together. And Chris and Colin, thank you so much for your time in presenting this super helpful information. Just from ACR, I imagine folks, if you are a member of ACR, you've seen that the annual conference is coming up. It's scheduled for November 11th through 13th in Omaha, Nebraska. So a great opportunity to go and visit the Midwest at a beautiful time of year, I would imagine. There is a call for proposals. They're due March 27th. I know within EPP, we've been encouraging members to brainstorm and even let us know what topics you might be interested in, so that we can make sure that there's a nice breadth and spectrum of topics that are interesting for the EPP section of members. So again, those proposals are due March 27th. And lastly, if you are interested in serving or volunteering some of your time with EPP, please let us know. We're always in search of, building a nice diversity of experience and other practitioners in supporting the leadership committee and the things that we do, because it is volunteer run. So, but thanks for everyone's time. And again, Mary, for helping put this thoughtful agenda together for all of us. It's great.
If you all get 5 minutes back to yourself, I consider that a big win in anybody's day. Take some good notes, nudge a friend, tell someone something wonderful that happened to you today. But we really appreciate you showing up today so that we have a conversation that is continuing throughout 2024 as we will explore more rosters. And if you have suggestions that you want us to bring in, please send us an email. We're open to your ideas and we're trying to be responsive to all of you. So thanks again. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good to see you, Deborah.